Muy buenas tardes. All right, so you all have been sitting for how long? I think it's fair to make a simple request. So my request is this. If you are able to, if you would stand and just kind of move around like this a little bit. Por favor, de pie y muévanse un poco. Yeah. Just move around. Stretch a little bit. Yes. We are not going to do a Zumba class, but I think it's important to get the blood flowing a little bit. Thank you very much. I want to first comment on, I think, the insight and the due diligence, I think, with which the organizers have crafted this and constructed this and really imagined a title to this conference that I think is quite compelling and I think in some ways exciting and even provocative. So connecting communities through our languages, cultures, and stories to me makes a lot of sense. The 42 years I want to speak to a little bit, and because as I share stories with you, and as I share this talk with you, that I have titled From Taming a Wild Tongue to Building a Bilingual University, I have to tell you that I especially take seriously, from the title, the idea of stories. So I would like to, with your permission, engage in a little bit of storytelling. So I think I want to do 4 stories with you today. So my talk here in the next little bit, I don't know how long I'm going to talk. It really depends on how I'm seeing your faces. So, si los veo con energía, then I may complete my talk. If I see you falling asleep on me, then, we may be, I don't know, abbreviating my talk. No, we're not going to do that. So I want to talk about stories, and I want to talk about 42 years. Because I actually, in sharing a personal story, so I'm going to start with story number 1. This is about personalizing the bilingual movement. I will, in some ways, at different parts of my talk, tell you a little bit about how I come to this and try to embed myself in a personal way within this bigger narrative of building institutions that are responsible to our children, to our adults, to our families, and to our communities as well. So I'll begin by personalizing this, and I'll suggest to you that it's actually more than 42 years from me. I want to show you where I'm from. Right, Texas is a very large state. You can actually, go from El Paso, travel 900 miles south and still be in Texas. I mean, California is a good-sized state, but Texas is pretty massive. I come from the southernmost tip of Texas. And so you see it on the map here. And you see on the blowout there, the little communities of Elsa, of Edcouch, and the larger communities of Edinburgh and McAllen. I live in Edinburgh, which is where the university is. Edinburgh is a county seat and the place where the university is. So there's a good amount of vitality, vibrancy that is, economic, intellectual, etc., because it's a university town. So this is where I come from. And this is where I come from too. This is a photograph of when I was a little boy. I'm the kid in the middle. With my father, cuando mi papá nos llevó al consulado mexicano en Monterrey, Nuevo León. En Monterrey, Nuevo León, para aplicar, para venirnos para los Estados Unidos legalmente. I have a great deal of sympathy and empathy for people who cross borders. I have to tell you, whether they do it legally or whether they do not do it legally, because in my father's own autobiography that he wrote many years ago, my father went up to the 4th grade in rural Nuevo León, Doctor Cos, Nuevo León, pero yo le pedí en una ocasión a mi papá que si él podía escribir sus cuentos, sus historias, and so my father wrote his autobiography. And so when my father crafted his autobiography, he told many stories about swimming across el Río Bravo, así le decían al Río Grande, swimming across the Río Bravo, you know, before they built the dams. And so my father would write these stories about que venía para acá por la necesidad. Y así como mi papá, muchas gentes vienen para acá por la necesidad, por buscar la vida. So in this photograph, you see my father, you see my oldest brother Pepe, my second oldest brother Miguel, y luego Paco es el chiquito, ese soy yo. You see the seal of la República de México, porque ahí en el consulado le pusieron el sello, porque pues, you know, we were arreglando los papeles, ¿verdad? And so we would come across on the last day of the year of 1968. And we would land in this small community of Elsa, agricultural community. So we lived, the very first place we lived in was in an old shack that had been built for braceros. Perhaps you've heard of braceros. And during the war, the Second World War, 1942, the U.S. economy needed workers, and the Mexican economy needed to get rid of young men who were restless, needed work, and so there was an international labor agreement called the Bracero Program. And so on the U.S. side, they built housing, you know, those kinds of things, right? Y so muchas de esas casitas todavía las encontramos en muchas comunidades. And so my parents actually found work in a farm, y Mr. Galloway nos prestó una de las casitas de los braceros. So we lived in a little bracero shack essentially for about a year and a half. And then my parents applied for federal housing, and we landed an apartment on 3rd Street in Elsa, about 1971. Y ahí es donde nos creamos nosotros, mis hermanos y yo. Oh, by the way, I do want to tell you, because I think that there was commentary here by the superintendents, you know, about, you know, the energy and the vitality and the brilliance of immigrant children. Okay, the only one who's not here is my little brother Luis, who would be born after we came across, pero quiero que vean. Okay, Pepe, PhD in divinity. Miguel, PhD in leadership. Yo, PhD in leadership también. No. Pero no les digo para que me aplaudan. No, les digo porque this is what a Mexican family in the U.S. looks like. This is what it can look like if we do the right things by them. And here's the other part of this. You know, my mother never went to school. Ella se creó en un ranchito en el estado de Tamaulipas. She never went to school. But my mother is the smartest woman in the neighborhood. She learned how to read by reading the Bible. And all my mother knows is how to take care of people, how to care and love people. And that was the best college prep program we ever had. So this is where the first story really begins. So I'm 6 years old. This is before 1st grade. And we were already living in the housing projects. And my father and I were going to go to the store, to the grocery store. And so we went down 3rd Street and then turned the corner onto Farm Road 88, this one fateful day. Ahora, mi papá, porque venía de los ranchos, mi papá siempre usaba un sombrero, así uno de estos, un sombrero muy fronterizo. You know, it's practical because a lot of people grow up in el campo, as my father did, as a goat and sheep herder. So it's practical, but it's also symbolic for a lot of Mexican men. So this one day, as we're turning the corner, my father and I, onto 88, my father, in one fell swoop, took off his hat when he saw a woman walking toward us. Took off his hat, stood between this woman and me, and then proceeded to say this. It was all in Spanish because my father never learned English. So mi papá dice, mijo, quiero que conozcas a la señora Longoria. I want you to meet Mrs. Longoria, my father said. And apparently, the woman who was approaching us was Mrs. Longoria. because she stopped dead in her trek. So the woman was curious, intrigued by who is this man who just took off his hat. And it looks like he's talking to me, and he's talking to this little boy. Mijo, quiero que conozcas a la señora Longoria. I want you to meet Mrs. Longoria. Mrs. Longoria, my father says in Spanish, is the most important person in this community. Mrs. Longoria is a teacher. So this is the most important man in my life who, I as an impressionable 6-year-old boy am looking up literally and figuratively at my father. And my father is not telling me that the most important person in the community is the mayor, the town doctor, the engineer. My father's telling me in a lot of different ways that if I want to be important in life, and who does not want to be important in life? Like, who here, who does not want to be important in life? We all have that need to be important. So my father's telling me, if I'm going to be important in life, I have to become a... So there's Mrs. Longoria, right? Intrigued by this whole kind of performance thing. Y ella lo saluda a mi papá, y mi papá la saluda a la señora Longoria. Mi papá so valued teachers. When my father went to school in rural Nuevo León, in Doctorcos, municipio de Doctorcos, Nuevo León, my father loved school. He went to the 4th grade 3 times. ¿Por qué se ríen? Seriously, that's not even funny. Do you know why he didn't go to the 5th grade? There was no 5th grade in the rural school. There was no 5th grade in the rural school. My father would have had to have left to the big city, to Monterrey. Pero mi papá tenía miedo. Y él creía que no tenían recursos, that sort of thing. So there were a bunch of different reasons why my father didn't go to Monterrey. But my father went to the 4th grade 3 times, and he loved his teachers, he loved school, he kept all his textbooks. And so he engaged Mrs. Longoria, and Mrs. Longoria engaged my father as well. A couple months later, I would go to the 1st grade at Ed Couch Elementary School, and guess who my teacher would be? Mrs. Longoria. Mrs. Longoria would become my teacher. I'm the kid down there. I don't know that I can get to this, but I'm the kid who's kind of going like this. Así? Yeah. Sitting on the bottom row. Here's the fascinating thing about Mrs. Longoria. As you can see, Mrs. Longoria, who kind of has the look of a school marm, right? Mrs. Longoria was an extraordinary teacher. She was already in her late 50s. Mrs. Longoria, Marta Longoria, had a master's degree when I became her student. Mexicana with a master's degree in the early 70s. Very accomplished. In 1968, Congress passed the Bilingual Education Act, which was sponsored by U.S. Senator Ralph Yarbrough out of Texas, and then a bunch of other people, right? Ralph Yarbrough had actually been mentored by LBJ, and you may know the story of LBJ, that his first job was at a Mexican school in Cotula, Texas, so LBJ became so sensitized. And so this is where the civil rights movement, at least for LBJ, begins. In 1929, as a teacher and principal of a one-room schoolhouse in Cotula, Texas. In fact, he said that in 1965 inaugural address. He cites his experience. Then he would mentor Ralph Yarbrough. The Bilingual Education Act would be passed in 68. It'd be hammered out in 69. By 1970, it's kind of beginning to hit the schools. In 1971, room 3 at Ed Couch Elementary School would become an experimental bilingual education classroom run by one Marta Longoria. And I would become Mrs. Longoria's student. And this is how Mrs. Longoria treated me. She cared and she loved me in Spanish, because I didn't know English. She taught me so that me, cognitively, intellectually, socially, culturally, would become well-wired in my native tongue. Mrs. Longoria somehow knew that the spirit of the Bilingual Education Act was about doing this conmigo and with the other children in the classroom. I was so blessed, so fortunate, so privileged to be in the classroom with Marta Longoria. I had no idea what was going on at the age of 6. The story that I'm telling you now, I didn't learn this story until I was full grown. I was already a teacher. And when I went back to Mrs. Longoria, when I came back from college to become a high school teacher at my alma mater, Mrs. Longoria was still at the elementary school. She was 70-some. Fui la visité, and I did an oral history with Mrs. Longoria, and she laid out this whole story, and I said, wow. I thought, this is an unbelievable story. This is my story, I'm thinking. So I thanked Mrs. Longoria profusely, and this is when I began to think in terms of how bilingual education may be an answer for children like me. Thanks to Mrs. Longoria. Story number 2. Okay. No se me han dormido, eh? Okay, vamos bien. Okay. So story number 2, I got to lay out here the context for the story that I just told you, story number 1. Because in 1971, 1972, in the 60s, in Texas, in South Texas, not everybody was Marta Longoria. So in some ways, we could argue that this was anomalous behavior. Era algo que pasó, una experiencia un poco diferente quizás, la experiencia con la señora Longoria. This is what's happening though. During this time, the time of the building of the wild tongue, I'll get to the wild tongue so you can understand what I'm saying. In Hidalgo County, the Rio Grande Valley of South Texas is comprised of 4 counties. There's Cameron County, there's Willacy County, there's Starr County, and there's Hidalgo County. So I'm going to give you just a snapshot of the population. In Hidalgo County, we began to see that early in the century, the majority population group, you don't see it broken down here, but the majority population group tended to be Anglo-American. And so it was like maybe 60, 40 in the 20s. And then there was growth. But the growth tended to be Mexican immigrant growth, or just family growth. So what we began to see by the 1950s and 60s, we began to see the population grow steadily, and then it just like spikes in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. It just spikes. When it began, however, to move incrementally, we began to see the university also moving incrementally. So the story of the Wild Tongue is really about the story of the university where I work today. What used to be called Pan American College, Pan American University. So this is a photograph about 1968, a photograph about 1972. All right? This is what's happening, however, at this university during the 1950s is when the student body at the university began to shift. So by about the mid to late 50s, we began to see the university become more brown. When the university became more Mexicano, more Mexican-American, the university began to, in very strategic ways, recruit and hire more speech instructors. And so by the 1960s, mid to late 1960s, it was a very large department. It was also with English, but a spike in speech instructors. So I'll ask the question rhetorically. Why do you suppose? As we see the demographic shift, we see the increase in instructors. So these are some of the things that I've learned. Because for some years now, I have been engaged in a number of different oral history projects, but one of the oral history projects that has taught me the most is an oral history project on bilingual education in South Texas. And so I want to know who the teachers were in 1970, 71, 72. I want to know who the principals were. I want to know about the school leaders who were giving birth to this movement of bilingual education in South Texas. I want to know. And so I began to seek out elders. And there's a story that most of the elders tell. If you're over 55 years old, so I'm interviewing people mostly who are in their 70s and 80s. But if you are over 55 years old, you almost tell this story whether you like it or not, because it just happened. And the story is about language and about the treatment of language in schools. So I'm going to ask Chris to cue up a 2-minute excerpt from Ramon Viescas' oral history. Go ahead, Chris.
We were told not to speak Spanish at the public schools at Roosevelt. If you speak Spanish and we catch you, we're gonna paddle you. And one day I was drinking water at the water fountain. There was a window above. Principal's office, the water fountain was below, and I was there with a group of two or three of the students. I don't recall who, but I was probably engaged speaking Spanish. I don't recall that I was the one who said something in Spanish. But the next thing I hear is from the window, I thought it was God, Miss Thippen, Ramon, you know better than to speak Spanish. Come in the office, you know. But miss, come in the office. So I go to the office. And so she said, you know what the punishment is? Lift up your pant legs so that, lift up pant legs, and she'd spank us on the calves. And that happened to a lot of students, women and girls and boys. In the story I wrote for the CABE anthology, with your permiso, I'm going to quote it. I said, pinche vieja. Me pegó, no me dolió, me caló. It didn't hurt, you know, that she spanked me, but it hurt me. Because I didn't understand what was wrong with speaking Spanish. We knew that they didn't want us to do it, and some would be as bold and forward as to say, we don't know what you're saying. And we said, we're not talking about you, miss. Well, I don't know that, so don't smoke. So we'd run off the playground to the furthest corner where the teacher was not able to hear us, y nos hacíamos garras con el español, you know. And until they would say, y'all come over here.
Thank you, Chris. This story that Mr. Viescas tells, just about every elder tells this story. And you actually don't even have to prompt them. So this is actually in the historiography. And this is not unique to Texas, South Texas. I think that this is in a lot of parts of the country. And so the historiography has already begun to call this a historical trauma. Because you get it once, you get it again, and your siblings are getting it. And so then you are in many ways told to not speak that language here, and you know what, you better not speak it at home either. So we've seen these stories over and over again. The oral histories have taught me an awful lot. But somebody else has taught me an awful lot too. And so some of you may be familiar with the work of Gloria Anzaldúa. And if you haven't read Gloria Anzaldúa, you should go and read Gloria Anzaldúa. So Anzaldúa is probably our most famous alum from Pan American University. Gloria Anzaldúa grew up in Edinburgh, Texas, actually right outside of Edinburgh, in a tiny community of about 500, Hargill, Texas. Anzaldúa would go to Edinburgh High School. She would graduate from Edinburgh High School. Then she would go to the university, Pan American. When she went to register at Pan American, before she exited, she was sent to the speech table where she would be asked to read something, English, formal English. If you spoke with an accent, you would be dispatched to remediation, to remedial speech. Do you know this story? You know this story? Well, Anzaldúa, in her very, very famous book, which is now in its 20-some printing, and Gloria Anzaldúa, by the way, just to continue, about her prowess, it has become, in the last 20 years, one of the most important literary theorists, not only in this country, but in the world. I mean, the whole conference is on Anzaldúa in Germany. Their whole conference is on Anzaldúa at the University of Texas. A lot of folks in California know Anzaldúa. East Coast know Anzaldúa. So, but if you don't know Anzaldúa, it's because you haven't been assigned Anzaldúa. I'm assigning Anzaldúa to you today. In chapter 5 of Borderlands, entitled How to Tame a Wild Tongue. Ansaldúa actually speaks to this. So she says that, this is the second line toward the end, first full sentence. At Pan American University, I and all Chicano students were required to take 2 speech classes. Their purpose? To get rid of our accents. How do we pretend that this same university that did this for decades would then want to become a bilingual university, Spanish-English, a bicultural university that values Mexican and Mexican-American students? How can we pretend to do this? So I pose that question. Think about that. Because, you know, the story here of Pan American is wrought with problems, a lot of issues that we need to think about very critically. It started as a junior college back in 1926. The school in Brownsville also started as a junior college in 1926. When the state of Texas was sued by LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens, and MALDEF, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund, when they sued the state of Texas back in the 80s, because the flagship universities, the University of Texas and Texas A&M, were not doing justice or service to students of color. In other words, they had very few students of color in the huge universities. Ann Richards was the governor at the time, and Ann Richards invited the lawsuit. She wanted to be sued, and she wanted to lose this lawsuit. So some of you may remember Ann Richards, very progressive governor, the last progressive governor we've had in Texas. Ann Richards was sued. The case was heard by the Texas Supreme Court, and the state of Texas lost. So the state of Texas, especially the 2 flagships, had to do something about increasing the numbers of students of color. And so there was this initiative called the South Texas Border Initiative. It was brilliant, because this is what would happen. UT would take over Pan Am overnight, 10,000 brown students. A&M would take over Prairie View A&M overnight, 6,000 African American students. A&M would take over Texas A&M International now. So almost immediately, another 6,000, 7,000 Latino students. So it was brilliant. And the local people, like in the valley, at Pan Am, they wanted this because it brought greater attention and it would bring some resources. Even as we were playing the political game of, okay, you can take our numbers. Okay? So never mind the wild tongue story of before. Now the state is playing politics with the institution to satisfy court orders. But what about PUF? What happened to the Permanent University Fund? Listen to this. When the state of Texas passed the Constitution in 1883, one of the things that the state of Texas did in the Constitution was that it created something called PUF, Permanent University Fund. And PUF is very clear that whatever money is gotten from the proceeds of public lands in West Texas will go into the Permanent University Fund, which goes 2/3 to UT, 1/3 to A&M. Well, guess what? Oil was found. And guess what? The University of Texas is one of the wealthiest schools in the entire country, in the entire world. Texas A&M with 1/3, Texas A&M. Look at Texas A&M. The 7th largest endowment. University of Texas, it vacillates between 2nd and 3rd, but here, the 3rd at $24 billion. Well, you know what? We couldn't access the Permanent University Fund when we became UT Pan American because we had a pre-existing condition. Huh? They'll take our numbers, but you just can't take our money, our oil money. Now, understand this also about PUF. PUF is for brick and mortar, so you can build. PUF is brick and mortar. Now, we did have the designation as an HSI. You know HSIs? Hispanic-Serving Institutions. which was passed by Congress under the Higher Education Act. But this is all that HSI means, however. All HSI means is that you have 25% Latino students or more. That's all. And then you can compete for Title V money. That's all. It doesn't mean that the curriculum is going to be responsive to Latino students. All it means is that you have 25% and you can compete for some federal money. No más. So UT Pan Am and UT Brownsville were HSIs, but really with no money because we couldn't tap PUF. So this is what the leaders did, and this just happened 4 years ago. The leaders decided to create a law. This is Senate Bill 24. In that law, there would be a brand new university in South Texas, and if you check out the language here, it would abolish, this law would abolish UT Pan American and UT Brownsville. In 2013, my employment was no more. I was a professor at UT Pan American in 2013. We didn't have a job from one day to the next. Of course, there was a plan, right? The new university would be called UTRGV. Same campuses, but now university-wide, and now PUF eligible. PUF eligible. Why? Because we were born as a UT school. PUF eligible. This has been the impact of PUF. $500 million has come to South Texas. We've built a medical school. We've built all kinds of buildings because that's PUF money, brick and mortar. But you can't be happy with just buildings. So this is what the regents, under some pressure from the communities, the regents decided, you know what, let's do a different HSI. Yeah, you know, let's recruit good faculty, yes. Let's build a medical school. We need physicians in South Texas. But let's do it this way. Let's do it where we develop a university that is bilingual, bicultural, and biliterate. So this is really the HSI conundrum. What does it mean? ¿Sirve para algo? Well, we're seeing that with the iteration of this new university, we have a shot to do it. Now, I happen to think that you don't have to recreate yourself, I mean, you know, from scratch. You can actually do it if you have the right kind of leadership and the right kind of community support. It just so happens that this is our historical context. So this is what we did. We began to research. How is it that we can do this? How is it that we can create a bilingual, bicultural university? So we visited el Sistema Universitario de Ana G. Méndez in Puerto Rico, which was founded in the late 1950s for Puerto Rican youth who were monolingual Spanish-speaking and couldn't go to the English universities. A grand experiment. Ana G. Méndez now has campuses in the U.S. that are dual language university campuses. Dallas, Tampa, Washington, D.C. It's a beautiful process. It's a private school, however. But it's a beautiful process. We went to Canada to visit the University of Ottawa, which is a huge university, like 43,000 students. And at the University of Ottawa, you know that you can either do everything in English or everything in French, or you can do it in a combination thereof. Like you can go study history, and you can get a degree in history where you took every single class in French. So we were like blown away by that. And we thought, can we do that in South Texas? Can you do that? Can you do that in Anaheim? I don't know. So this is what we did. We created a new vision statement. And the vision statement says that we're going to be a premier HSI. And the vision statement is that we're going to be an engaged bilingual university. We created a B3 Institute, Bilingual, Bicultural, Biliterate Institute, and I'm the executive director of the B3 Institute, and we have our strategic goals. So the first goal is to build out the coursework. The second goal, incentivize research. Research that is related to bilingual, bicultural, biliteracy. I mean, you know, people can be professors there and do whatever research they want, but we're incentivizing this. Third goal is engage K-12 and community-based organizations and policymakers. Because we're going to need a feeder system. We need children to come in bilingual, bicultural, biliterate so that they can take full advantage of higher education. So this is where we are. So understand, this is a nascent project, the whole university thing, this is where we are. We are about to complete our first year with the B3 Institute. We piloted 3 courses last semester and this semester. And the course schedule for the fall semester shows 55 courses that will be taught in Spanish or bilingually. And I'm not talking about Spanish courses. I'm talking about chemistry. I'm talking about history. I'm talking about civil engineering. I'm talking about, courses across the curriculum. We have a dual language certificate that we're developing so that when a student finishes up the coursework and takes as many as 15 hours, the student will get a seal, a dual language certificate on their diploma. Our goal, however, is to be something like this, that any kid in this country or any grown-up in this country can go to our university, and if they want to study everything in Spanish, they can do that. If they want to study everything in English, they can do that as well, because we're always going to have that. We're realizing, however, our pilot courses taught us this, that we're far from ready in terms of our students coming in. Because, one of the things that I did is I canvassed the entire faculty. And there were like a bunch of faculty members que estaban como dormidos. Pero eran mexicanos, eran peruanos, eran dominicanos, and they said, hey, I'm here. Nobody knows me, but I'm actually in the engineering college. I want to teach in Spanish, they said to me. So we have this faculty, this kind of like an unbelievable latent talent and treasure that has been activated now because of this new opportunity. And we will continue to recruit people like those. But our students are not at the same level of readiness. Porque ellos no se crearon en Perú, se crearon en el Valle. And now Ramon Villescas will tell you the story of how he raised his children to be monolingual English speakers. And so when we were spanked, hit, admonished, marginalized, or whatever, they taught us a lesson. And the lesson would be manifest in how we raise our children. So why raise children to be Spanish speaking when I got hit? So our work with higher education is essentially to rehabilitate that cultural trauma, that historical trauma, that linguistic trauma. And so we've been working here to build a pipeline. Fortunately, a number of the school districts were already on board. In fact, part of the reason that we've gone toward a B3 university is because of the leadership of K-12. So we have a school district, for example, the FAR San Juan Alamo School District, PSJA we call it, that has been doing dual language for 22 years. 25 elementary schools, 7 middle schools, and 4 high schools. They go K-12 dual. Not only elementary. And we have other schools that when they began to hear the legislature's doing what, the university's doing what, well, you know what, if we're going to send our kids there, we better prepare. Now, we have 35 school districts in South Texas, and only these have said, we need to do something about this. The preponderance of the school districts are not there yet. The preponderance of the school districts and the leadership in schools is still in the other thinking. By the way, most of the leadership is Latino. But we as Latinos, we fall into this as well. In fact, it's tougher to get dual language programs, to get a buy-in in community with immigrant populations until you begin to have conversations with them. Y cuando van conociendo, when they begin to understand what the research says, what the good practice says, they'll buy in. That's the challenge, though, the discipline of building with communities. That is the challenge, the discipline of building relationships with communities. So in terms of incentivizing research, we've created 2 bilingual journals. And we're building learning communities and mentoring programs. And then we're also rethinking the tenure and promotion process to incentivize tenure and promotion in very different ways, which is really, that's a huge task. Because university faculty, are very, very set in their ways in terms of, they're not everybody, but, And then we drafted legislation to create a bilingual zone in South Texas. So here it is, House Bill 2678, that'll be heard in committee next week in the Texas legislature. We want to create a bilingual zone where all of South Texas becomes a bilingual zone. Official documentation, 2 languages. Signage, 2 languages. Frontline staff, 2 languages. So, para allá vamos. Para allá vamos. You know, we think that it's the right way to do higher ed. And we think that in this particular case, higher ed has been led by K-12, but we think that that's a circular process as well. So lo podemos hacer juntos. Pero no nada más higher ed en K-12, la comunidad especialmente. Porque si la mamá no quiere, o el papá no quiere, o la tía no quiere, o la abuela no quiere, then we have a challenge. So it is about building with community at the end of the day. Because if the community doesn't want to kill that dual language program, it's not going to be killed. Bureaucrats and school leaders can do whatever they want until the community says, And every smart administrator, and I'm looking at a superintendent here, ¿verdad que sí? Every smart administrator is going to say, sí, señora. I have about 3.5 minutes before I exhaust my complete time. And I hate to just give a talk and not respond to the, curiosity that somebody or some of you may have. And so I don't know if this is kosher here, but I'm happy to respond to questions here for about maybe 3 or 4 minutes. And Karling, solo que me digas tú que no. ¿Le damos? Okay, because we got like 3.5 minutes. Question, comment, observation, or maybe a heckler. Yes. Yes. Yeah, hang on. Who are you? Yes. Leonor Partida. Yes. Gracias. ¿Cómo? Did you say Donald Trump? Oh. ¿Cómo? How could the president hurt this work? Yes, no, I mean, there's 2 ways that I want to respond to that. One way is, of course, the president can disrupt and hurt this work, of course, because the president has the bully pulpit, first of all. The president, we've seen already, is introducing legislation that is cutting a lot of different things, like the Department of Education is 15% cut. A number of things as well with, the way the K-12 is going to be probably aligned differently with the targeted investment. But then here's the other piece. This is the other way I'll respond to it. La gente grande de edad en la comunidad de nosotros, the elderly people in our community, they're beginning to whisper stuff like this. What took you so long? What took you so long? What they're saying is to respect me, to respect my parents, to respect who we are, as cultural beings and as Americans. And so I think that this is one of the sources of strength for us. And I think that if we obey that kind of strength and wisdom, Donald Trump is irrelevant. I think so. Yeah. I'll take one more, and then because I think we're running late. Yes, ma'am. What is your name? Thank you. I appreciate that. So I want to do a part 2 with that because, when I was a high school teacher, I was a high school teacher for a dozen years. I trained my students on how to have conversations with elders. So I trained my students how to do oral histories. But the very first people that I started with, that I took my students actually to go interview, were my father and my mother. And then I continued with that. I continued to do an oral history with my father and my mother. So I've collected hours and hours and hours. I have footage of my mother, hours and hours and hours. And my mother tells beautiful stories. You know, at first when we took a camera and we had kids all over, you know, and put a lavalier mic on my mother didn't know what to do with it. You know, by the second installment me decía, mijito, pónmelo aquí. Y luego decía, y aquí mira, for the lighting, me decía. My father died in 2013. And I went to my archive. 5 years before my father died, in one of the oral history installments, I asked my father, Papi, ¿cómo quieres que se acuerde la gente de ti? How do you want to be remembered? And so my father gave like this riveting response. It was just beautiful as he spoke to the camera. So my father lay in his coffin at the funeral home, and I put the video on. And people came in to pay respect to my father. And my father was telling them how to think of him. So here's the lesson here, to me, it seems. You have elderly people in your families, you know, who are the storehouses of powerful wisdom. Y luego se nos mueren. Y luego se nos mueren. Don't allow them to leave us without having captured their wisdom. Every student I have has a responsibility of doing at least one oral history. And I find that most of my students then go do a second and third and fourth, and then they say, you know what, this is too important. This is too important for me. I got to capture mi abuelita or mi papa or whatever. You know, the cultural stuff, that's the cultural stuff. The identity stuff, that's the identity stuff. These are our sources of strength, not from people who have, you know, PhDs or whatever. No. Gente que trabajó. Gente que nos dio de comer. Gente que nos, you know, que nos protege. This is our source of strength. This, I think that at its core is really what CABE is about. Because this is not bilingual education. No, this is about loving children in ways that make sense to them, linguistically, culturally, etc. Okay. You guys have been a terrific audience. I know we lost a good number of people, but you know, people are busy. They got to do this and that. But those of you who stayed, wow. You know, ¿no se durmió nadie? No se durmió nadie? Okay. Enjoy CABE and, you know, celebrate the lives of your families and your communities. Thank you very much.